Welcome to Midi Quest Options Menu tutorial. This tutorial is dominated by the three main Midi Quest configuration options: the Preferences dialog, the Keyless dialog, and the Patch Skins dialog. Now we'll look at Preferences first. Preferences covers all of Midi Quest's various setup options, and there are a lot of them. So we'll take this a section at a time. The organization here is basically by window. So Patch Edit contains options for the Patch Editor, the Bank Editor, the Library window, the Studio window, MIDI Setup, the Tones, Cubase and Sonar name servers, which are only found in Midi Quest XL, the XML name server for Mac users, better known as midname files. This again is unique to Midi Quest XL. VST paths for Midi Quest XL. Plugin setup for Midi Quest XL. And various paths and other miscellaneous options. For Patch Edit, we have a right mouse button audition that is triggered by holding down the Control key and clicking your right mouse button while you're in a Patch Editor window. Now you have three options as to what that triggers. It can trigger a single note based on the location of the mouse in the window, where left to right across the window is pitch, and up and down the vertical position of the mouse within the window controls the output velocity. When the chord option is selected, Midi Quest will simply play the chord set up in the tones area of this dialog, and it will play those notes as a single chord, or if you choose sequence, then it will play those same notes set up here as a sequence. Standard mouse editing. For most of the editing controls, you have mouse control relative to either dragging the mouse left or right or up and down, and you can select a sensitivity option. So if we look at left-right drag, if I open up an editor here, then we were left-right, so I click the mouse and I drag left and right to change the value for any of these numerics or text descriptors. This will also work with knobs. Drag left and drag right, and the value changes. Switch to up down, and editing is now done by moving the mouse in the up and down direction, and this affects the knobs the same way. Sensitivity, this indicates the amount of drag you have to perform to change a value. So if I set that to 1, if you look, a little bit change and it moves really, really quickly. If I go back here and set the preferences to 4, then I have to move the mouse a fair bit in order to get the value to change. I'm going to return this to left, right, and 2, which are my preferences. Here, knobs have an additional editing option. They can either follow the standard mouse editing selection, or you can choose the rotary option. And when rotary is selected, then the knob literally works by dragging the mouse around the outside, just as if you were rotating a knob. When Show Selected Controls is checked, then you'll see a frame over or around what is currently the active control. If I go in and turn it off, then you'll see these controls are still being made active as I move the mouse over them, but nothing is visually being selected. Display parameter help. Each parameter in this editor can optionally have a help message to go with it. Now this editor isn't set up with it, but if any of these controls had a little bit of help that was an explanation for something unique about the parameter, it would show up in this lower help display area, as long as this option is checked, the display parameter help. Activate on mouse over. You'll notice that here, as the mouse goes over each of the controls, they are automatically activated. I can turn that off, and then you see this one maintains the activity until I go in and specifically click on another control to activate it. Now, Show Selected Controls is very useful option in that it tells you where the focus is. If you are going to do some direct numeric entry, then you might have your mouse over this option, but if you want to set, you go to type 78 to set a value, it's going to be applied to this selected control. Now, automated mouse over is a very nice option because it relates, or activate on mouse over, it relates to the smart control, which I'll display when I get down here. You can quickly point your mouse to over a particular control, and you can actually use the controller, if you want, on your MIDI keyboard to change the value. Auto menu. On controls that have a limited value range, let's see if I can find one here. If I choose auto menu, then a click, instead of bringing up a numeric entry box, you get a little menu that makes it easy to select from a small number of options. And pop-up info. You'll notice that as I go over each of these controls, I get a little pop-up that says what it is, operator 3 amplitude modulation sensitivity. And it shows me the current value. Now I can choose to have that displayed for all controls, no controls, just knobs and sliders, or all controls in the status bar. So if you don't want the pop-up to appear, you can turn it off. Knobs and sliders, for this selection here, you don't get a pop-up because the value is right visible in front of you. It's 11, it's 17. For a knob, it's not so, it's graphically obvious, but you don't get the precise number. So when you point the mouse over, you can get the actual value there at 70, and as you edit, you can see the actual numeric value that is being sent to the instrument. All controls does this for all controls, and then all controls in the status bar. You'll see that the value is displayed down here in the status bar. As I change this, it gets updated. My preference is for all controls. Update patch on activate. There are three options here. Midi Quest is capable of having multiple editors of the same type open at the same time, just like this. Now, what this option allows you to do, by default it's turned on. So when you activate this window, Midi Quest will send this entire patch down to the instrument. So the instrument is in sync with this editor. When you switch back to this editor, Midi Quest dumps this entire patch down to the instrument so that when you perform editing in this window, again, the instrument is in sync with what you're doing. Now, some people don't want the entire patch sent down to the instrument each time a window gets activated. They know they're never going to open up two editors at the same time and get into difficulty. And in this situation, you have the option of turning it off. This is particularly useful in scenarios where you have an editor that is editing a large data file, maybe something at, say, 100K, where it takes 5 or 6 seconds to download, and it can be very annoying to click on the window and not to be able to do any real editing for 5 or 6 seconds, as the instrument is updated with what's currently in the window, but in actual fact, the instrument already had this data correctly set up. Custom allows whether this option happens or not is controlled by a setting within the instrument's template. If there is no setting in the instrument's panel or template, then custom is by default set to on, but it is possible to turn it off. Play after edit. Play after edit, when it is checked, going in and changing a value. When you release the mouse, a note on event will automatically be sent to the instrument so you can hear that sound change. Now, I don't have a DX7 connected up, so you're not hearing anything, which is fine, but that's how the option works. I'm going to turn it back off. Store bitmaps. Midi Quest, each time you open an editor, you have the option. Midi Quest loads that editor from disk, and that can include a whole collection of bitmaps necessary to build the editor. Now you have an option here. If you don't have a lot of memory in your computer, by default this is on. All of your bitmaps get stored. So when you close the DX7 editor, all the bitmaps that were opened with the DX7 are freed from memory, and that frees up memory space for other things. If you've got a lot of memory in your computer, you can leave this on, and the next time you go to open your DX7 editor, Midi Quest doesn't have to spend the time reloading all your bitmaps, and your editor will load up much more quickly. No mouse limit. By default, when I dragged, you see the mouse is being held very close to the parameter. This ensures that even if this has a very large value, you can't pull the mouse off the screen. It will just keep going and going and incrementing the value till you get to where you want. Now, the alternative to that, which some people have requested, is to be able to turn that option off. So there's no mouse limiting. And when you do that, you'll see that the mouse can drag as far as you want, and with the downside that it can get very, very far away from the parameter that you're editing, which may not be the behavior that you want. And I like my mouse limiting. It's not the final segment. This option, or set of single mode option, handles how a patch, when it is being edited from a bank, is stored back in the bank when you've requested to edit another patch in that bank. So manual store is the default, and what happens here is you've selected a patch from the bank, you're editing away, you go back to the bank, select a different patch, double click on it to edit it, and you get a pop-up dialog that says, where do you want to store your already edited patch? The next option is Midi Quest doesn't query you. You just, when a patch is edited and you choose another one, the previously edited patch is, stored back right where it came from. And the final option is, if you go to edit a new patch, any changes that were made to the previous patch, if you haven't manually stored them yourself, they're automatically discarded without giving you any kind of warning message. Now we'll get to our final group of options. The grid here controls layout of the editor. If you're not designing and creating your own editors, then you don't care about this. If you are creating your own editors and you want to have a drop grid so that, say, controls can only be placed on an 8x8 grid, then you set up 8x8, and you'll only be able to position your control at like 0.8, 0.16, 0.24, 0.32, or 8.0, 8.8, 8.16, 8.24, 8.32. This makes it easy to line up controls in a specific pattern without having to get, I need to shift this control by 1 pixel to the left or 1 pixel to the right. Patch randomize. In the editor, you have some randomization features. Right here, randomize, full randomize, constrained randomize. When you choose constrained randomize, basically it takes the current value, Midi Quest generates an additional random amount to be plus or minus the current value and applies it to the default value. Now, this parameter here controls the degree of randomization, or how far you can get from that original value. 100% is basically the same as doing pretty much a full randomize, but you could say, okay, I want to get only 25% away from where I currently am. So if your parameter had a range of 0 to 100, and you set this to 25, then Midi Quest would go and say your current value was 50. It would go, okay, my percentage is 25. I can generate a random value anywhere between 0 and 25% of 100. 25% of 100 is 25. So I can generate a random number between 0 and 25, and I'm going to take half of that, and so the current value, the current parameter value, if it was 50, could land up anywhere between 38, which is 12 under 50, or 62, which is 12 above 50. Floating editor refresh in seconds. If you're using floating editors, which is an old feature, and with multiple windows and Midi Quest plugins, you don't really need to use that much anymore. This controls the frequency of the refreshing of those floating editors to ensure that the floating editor stays in sync with the full Midi Quest window. The final option here is the Smart Controller option. Now what this does is it allows you to use a MIDI controller as a general editing controller for the entire editor. So if I set this to -1, I'm saying that I don't want to use any controller, or starting at 0, that would be CC0 or CC1 and so on all the way up to 123. So if I set it to 1, and notice I'm not moving the mouse, I just have the mouse pointing over this particular control, and I'm moving CC1, which is your modulation controller. Now, if all I have to do is move the mouse to another location, and I can edit. Now, I also have the option of I'm not going to activate on mouse over, and now I can actually use the computer keyboard controls to move around, and I can now just easily change values just through cursoring through the controls and using a controller value to change each of the parameters. Now, all of this type of thing will be covered much more closely in the actual, when we discuss the patch editor in a different tutorial. So let's move back to preferences, have a look at the bank edit tab. Now, these are all parameters that apply to the bank editor. Audition enable. When this is off, there is no auditioning when you click on a patch. When you have it checked, then if you go to, minimize this, go to an editor and click on different patches. And what Midi Quest does is it actually sends this patch from the computer down to the instrument, and then it actually plays the sound for you so that you can hear it. This means that you don't actually have to have these patches in the instrument in order to audition them. Here you have control over the type of auditioning. You've heard the sequence there. If I set it to chord, then what you do is you get a chord played back. Or sysx only. What happens here if you choose sysx only is that the sysx data for that patch is sent down to the instrument, but Midi Quest doesn't trigger the playing of a chord or a sequence. Now, additional options that you have: keep backup. When that is checked, then every time you make an edit to your patch bank, Midi Quest will store the previous state and allow you to return to it using the undo function. Respond to patch changes. If this is enabled, then you can actually send patch change commands from a keyboard controller, and Midi Quest will follow those patch commands. And so if you send command 0 or patch change 0, you'll get the first entry selected. Patch change 1, you'll get the second entry selected, and so on through your entire bank. The third option is use parent-child relations. Now, this is a fairly complex concept, and I believe you're going to do a little tutorial that is dedicated solely to handling this. parent-child relationships are only enabled when you're working within a set window. And basically what it does is it allows, when you have a hierarchical instrument such as an M1 where you have combinations or performances that in turn select a group of patches to play. In the case of the M1, you can select up to 8 different patches where each one has its own channel, keyboard range, and so on and so forth. When you rearrange patches, enabling this option ensures that the combinations that reference the patches are also updated at the same time, so everything stays in sync. Edit patch using patch number. What happens when you enable by default, which is the off option, Midi Quest will attempt to use the default assignment for that instrument. It usually, if the instrument has a play buffer, which many of them do, then your editing is all done within the play buffer. If the instrument doesn't have a play buffer, then you have to, in order to audition, you actually and edit, you have to send the patch to a specific memory location in the instrument and then select that memory location. An example of this is all of the EMU Proteus instruments all work this way. So in this situation, you basically have two options. By default, the patch number or the location assigned in the patch driver is where all of the editing occurs. Now, some people prefer that the editing occur in the location currently selected in the bank. So, for example here, if you have patch 6 selected, then Midi Quest will actually send the patch you've selected here down to location 6, select location 6, and start editing location 6 so that everything stays in sync. There's a positive and negative to each of these options. The advantage to having this option off is that if the bank that you have loaded up in Midi Quest is different from the bank that you have on the instrument, then on the instrument when you start editing, you're only going to destroy one patch location. Now that's usually by default either the first or the last location in the bank, and all of the other entries within that bank stay the same. That's nice. You're only destroying one location. The downside of that is it can be a little confusing because in Midi Quest you're looking at patch 6 and yet you look at your instrument and maybe you're editing patch 99, and some people don't find that intuitive at all. So the alternative is to turn this option on, and what happens then is that, as I've said, if you have patch 6 selected, the patch gets sent down to location 6 and you edit from location 6. Now that's really good if the bank you have loaded here is identical to the bank that you currently have in the instrument. You'll send analog would overwrite analog, for example, and you can do your editing and everything is fine. However, if the bank you have loaded in Midi Quest is actually different from the bank on the instrument, you can end up with a real mess because you edit patch 6, then you jump to, say, the 23rd patch and edit that one, and then you jump to the 16th patch and you do a little bit of editing there, and then what you have on your instrument is the bank that you remember downloading plus 3 or 4 or 5 patches that aren't normally in that bank that are now stored in that bank. You run the risk of landing up and finding that you have sounds where you don't expect them to be. And this final option applies to when you are working with patch banks by themselves or patch banks that are stored in combinations. When any situation where you have a patch bank and a split, and on the right hand side you're actually doing edits. Here you have two options. If you have this option checked, then when you go to save that bank, before saving the bank, all of your patch edits are written back into the bank and saved with the bank. If this option is left unchecked, then any edits that you have in your patch editor aren't actually stored into the bank until you close the editor, that split editor window, and return or select a different patch in the bank, at which time everything is updated. Again, this is a trade-off in operations. If you have this option checked, then you're sure that any changes that you make are guaranteed to get written into your patch bank and saved when you choose Save, at the risk of overwriting what you currently have. The flip side to this option is if you have this option turned off, then if you need to escape from an edit, you can always close the window. You can still save everything else, close the window, and changes that you don't want that you've got in this temporary patch editor within the bank window won't overwrite something that is already in the bank that you want to keep. Drag and drop, internal. There are three options here, and this controls what happens when you perform a drag and drop within a bank. So for example, you can swap, paste, or insert. In a swap, I'll show you. If you say, click on vanilla and drag to nightfall and release, there. But these two options have just swapped their position. The next option is paste. Now if we grab here, drag and drop, big strings has been pasted onto the location that you dropped it on. And the final option is insert. Now what happens here is that if I take nightfall and drag it into here, it's going to insert it. So it's going to move all of the patches below this location down one position to make room for nightfall. And let me return to my default settings. Drag and drop external is the same concept, but here you're dragging from one bank to another bank in another window. By default, the operation is to paste, but you also have the option to insert the patch as well. Library. These are all the options that apply to a library. That first off is the default view. That is the view that the library opens with. So by default it's a list. So if I go here and I open up a library for my DX7, here's the library and it's displayed as a list and I can see all of my key information. Oops. Next option is to open as the names type, and here open up the same one, and this time what you see is simply a list of the names, without any additional information, but it's more compact and you can see a lot more entries in the library at a time. This option will display the library with small icons if those icons are available. And the final option will display with large icons, again if those icons are available. Audition. The audition option here is exactly the same as the audition option for the bank editor. If it's checked, then clicking on the patches in a library will send that patch down to the library and then play it. Add patches mode. Whenever you add patches to the library from a bank or from another source, you have an option as to how those are added. So if you're adding a bank, you can choose to add all the patches to the list without any kind of querying. You can choose this option, in which case only unique patches are added to the list. So what happens is each patch that you want to add, Midi Quest automatically looks through the entire existing library. If it finds that patch is already there, then it doesn't add it. Otherwise, if it's unique, it does. Add any patch with a unique name. Basically, again, instead of this operation is faster because all you have to do is test the name of the patch. Midi Quest looks at the name of the patch being added, compares it to all of the names in the existing library. If the name is unique, that patch is added to the library. Now, it might only be the name that's unique, and the rest of the sound could be an exact match with an entry that's already in the library, but it will still be added. Verify on name match. Basically, Midi Quest takes each patch, compares the name against all of the names in the library. If it finds an identical match, it asks you whether you still want to add that patch to the library or not. Verify on identical patch is the same as adding unique patches, but the difference here is that if it finds a match, it will again say, I found a match, do you want to still add this patch to the library or not? And you can decide whether or not you want to add it. And then add sorted. Midi Quest, if you have this option checked, Midi Quest will attempt to maintain sorting in the library. So it will take the patch, look at the name, and start looking down the patch list until it finds the first patch where the name is higher in value than the name of the existing patch, and that patch is inserted before that name that you found. So if the patch name starts with an R, it's going to pass anything with a letter before R. As soon as it reaches a name where the letter starts with an S, a T, or so on, it's going to insert that name right there before that and attempt to maintain the sorted order of your library. These two options, from within the library itself, it is possible to do a patch mix and a patch blend. And what these both do is generate a new library with new patches in them, and you can determine here how many new patches are generated by that mix or blend operation. By default it's 50, but you could ask to have 200 patches generated or just 25, however many you would like. The final area is column key names. Now if you look at a library, you'll see that it has 8 keys, where each key, whoops, we're going to need to open up the library so that it's in list mode. There we go. You can see that the library has 8 keys. Now each of these keys can contain descriptive information on the sound. So here the patch is called bass synth, and it's a bass type sound. It's also a synth type sound, and another word to describe it would be, say, synthetic, where here you've got a bell orc sound, it's got bells, and it's got an orchestra combination. Now, for each of these keys, if you use each column, you can enter your own keys for description, and if you decide to use, say, key 1 to be the basic sound descriptor, you could, instead of calling it just key 1, call it basic sound, and that will tell you at a glance what each column is used for, and that does not take effect until you open the library again. And now that you can see, column 1 is considered the basic sound. Now, let's get rid of our library. I believe that covers everything in the library area. Let's move on to Studio. Studio has a smaller number of options. Component auto update. You have 3 options here. This is a very important option as far as Midi Quest is concerned, and by default it is set to on, and you normally want to leave it. Here's how you should configure. You should leave it on unless you have 2 instruments of the same type. So you have 2 DX7s or 2 MT32s. In that situation, you're going to want to set it to on except for channel, port, or patch number. Now you can choose to turn this option off. Usually the only people who turn this option off are people who are doing development work. Now, what this does is when you load an instrument, when you load data files from disk, each Midi Quest data file actually has driver information encoded into it that tells it how to send and how to do other things. What this means is very nice. You can take your DX7 data file from your computer, take it over to your friend's computer that's got Midi Quest installed, and even if the DX7 instrument is not installed on your friend's computer, you can actually still open up the file, because the description, open up the file, send it. If it's a bank, you'll be able to audition, arrange patches, and so on, because all of this descriptive information is stored right in the file. What happens when you have this option turned on is that when the files are loaded, Midi Quest automatically updates the file with any new driver information that you might have downloaded from SoundQuest's website, because we have updated a driver, which is why you want to leave this on, or with multiple instruments, leave it on with the exception of the channel and port information, so that each data file will remain current and be able to send properly. This option, when checked, it'll take a while, but when you load Midi Quest, it will automatically load the selected set for each instrument. And I leave that off. AutoSense when adding instruments is as it says. If you have this option selected, then when you go and install a new instrument from the CD or from SoundQuest's website, then Midi Quest will automatically perform an AutoSense to attempt to find the instrument channel and port information. Or myself, personally, I prefer to leave this off. I know where each of my instruments is connected, and I will simply make the port assignments once the instrument is loaded. This option, add ROM banks to new sets. If you check this option, then let's cover it with off first. When this option is turned off, then when you create a new set, the elements of that new set will exactly follow the definition from as set up in the instrument creator window. Now, sometimes you've got additional ROM banks, or you like the default set, but you also at the same time want all of the ROM banks to automatically be defined. You can check this option. Then when a new set is created, not only the selected entries will be added to the new set, but also any ROM banks will be added as well. This makes auditioning patches from ROM banks in particular very easy. This option, there are some drivers in Midi Quest that allow you to make a numeric selection when you are loading data from an instrument. For example, a K1. You can load a bank, but the K1 doesn't have a patch buffer area, but you can't. So the individual patch driver allows you to load from any one of 32 or 64 locations. Now, when this happens, let me load in an instrument where you actually do this kind of thing. And EMU is another great selection for this. The EMU Proteus, because it doesn't have a play buffer, you'll see that the preset here has a PCH number. This means when you ask to load a preset, you will load it from a particular location. Now, you can set the PCH number one of two ways. You can go into the settings button, and there's your patch number, and you can preset it to any value you want. So if I set it to 9, press OK. Then if I ask to load a preset from the instrument, by hitting the receive button, Midi Quest will go out and request preset number 9. Now, the other way to do this is to check this option. And when I check this option, then as part of the request, you'll get a little pop-up dialog saying, what entry do you want to load? And at that point, you can say, oh, I want to load 23, or I want to load patch 64, or you can choose to load whatever patch it is you want at that time. The final option here is automatically define patches and banks. Actually, I'm going to cover that one last. Let's look at this instead. pbay delay time. For those people who are still using patch bays, by definition, if you have a multi-port MIDI interface, sometimes these are also referred to as patch bays. From a Midi Quest point of view, they aren't. What you have, if your MIDI interface connects directly to the computer, it is a MIDI interface. It is not a patch bay. Any of the patch bay references that you see in the Midi Quest manual, the Midi Quest help files, ignore them. That is not a patch bay. A patch bay is a separate piece of hardware that has only MIDI connections, no USB, only MIDI connections, and the way these patch bays work is there's a MIDI cable going from the MIDI out of the interface to your computer that goes into the patch bay, and then that MIDI data is routed to the various MIDI out ports in the patch bay, and it gets routed there. In this situation, Midi Quest, in order to talk to various instruments, has to be able to control the patch bay in order to set it up and request so that the connections are right to request and send data to that instrument when you're editing. This parameter controls the amount of delay between when Midi Quest sends the control request information to the patch bay and when it then sends the request to the instrument. So in this case, we're saying there's 4/10 of a second assigned to allow the patch bay to make all of its connections so that Midi Quest can now properly talk to a particular instrument. You can change that value from anywhere from 0 up to 100. So that's up to 10 seconds of delay time, which would be more than enough to allow any patch bay to configure itself. But there are very few people we know who are still using patch bays today. We're down to our last parameter here, automatically define patches and banks. Midi Quest for version 10 has added a little bit more security. It makes it harder for you to create a new patch or a new bank and then send it down to the instrument. It will give you an error when you try and create a new patch. It will say, this data is being sent to the instrument. Are you sure you want to create this? And the reason we did this was because people were accidentally overwriting data with new, basically zeroed files that they were opening and mistakenly sending to their instrument and wiping out valid data. So, by default, under most situations, you probably want to leave this turned off. Now, if you choose to turn this option on, then what happens is whenever you create a new patch bank or a new patch, Midi Quest will automatically define all of these various data files, and you won't get any error messages. You'll be free and able to immediately download any of them. The advantage, no error messages. The risk is that you could potentially overwrite data in your instrument with zeroed data from Midi Quest. So you want to use a great deal of care when you work with change this option. The MIDI tab covers MIDI-related options. MIDI through, there are a whole series of different MIDI through options, as you can see. By default, it is set to by default it is set to the auto option. So off, there is no MIDI through at all. So any information that arrives at a MIDI import, nothing is done with it as far as passing it through to another port goes. If you have MIDI through turned on, then what happens is any MIDI data that arrives at a MIDI import is automatically routed to and output to the default MIDI output port selected over here. Auto. Auto is a sophisticated option. What happens here is any MIDI data arriving at a MIDI import is routed to the output port of the currently active window. So, for example, if this set window is active, then it's going to go to this MIDI out port here. If you have a collection window active, then the output will be routed to the port selected for what the port used by whatever data is currently selected in this window. So you can easily route MIDI input to various instruments just by clicking on them as you work with their appropriate editors. If the studio window is active, it gets even more sophisticated in that whatever type of data, instrument, and data type is selected, whatever port is assigned to this instrument is the MIDI out port that the incoming MIDI data will be routed to. MIDI channel is basically the same as the MIDI on option, with the addition that as the MIDI data is output, it will be rechannelized to whatever MIDI channel is selected here. So if you want it to go out on MIDI channel 4, then set it to 4, and that will go as expected. Auto with Smart Port is designed to minimize the chance of MIDI loops for some instruments, which will route incoming MIDI data to their MIDI output as well. So Auto works exactly the same as Auto does here, with the exception that if the incoming MIDI data is on the same MIDI port as the currently selected instrument, there is no MIDI through at all. So, well, basically that's how it works. It only accepts data from ports other than the MIDI import of the currently active data. Auto from default MIDI import works similarly, except in this case the data is only routed if it comes from the default MIDI import. Include real-time events. By default, this is turned off, and real-time events such as start, stop, continue, and MIDI clock events, when they arrive at a MIDI port, they're just thrown out. If you turn this on, then those events as well are echoed out the MIDI port. Now this allows a source MIDI instrument to generate MIDI clock and controller information and have that routed to another instrument so that that instrument is slaved to the source. However, if you've also got a sequencer running that's generating this information, the two will clash. So you only want to have this turned on if you're not using a sequencer or other MIDI source as the clock source. Default settings. There are various locations in the program that need a default MIDI channel, a default MIDI import, default MIDI output. This is where these options are set. And the final three MIDI control parameters here control the output on a global basis of sysx data. Now, the important thing to remember about these is they are set once when the program is started. So if you change these values, then to have them take effect, you've actually got to quit, set the parameters, then quit Midi Quest, and restart Midi Quest. You don't have to reboot the computer, you just have to restart the program. First option, delay between sysx transmissions. This is the amount of time, they're all in milliseconds, a delay amount that will be inserted between each sysx transmission. Now, when we do sysx, we work with the instrument and we make sure that each piece of sysx is happily accepted by the instrument. Unfortunately, sometimes manufacturers will do a ROM update to their instrument, which also can slow down the sysx response time of the instrument. So sometimes it's actually necessary to either go in and manually update a driver, or you can do this, it's much easier at a global level. If all the sysx isn't being successfully or properly received, you can slow down the rate, or in this case, add a bit of extra time between each sysx transmission to allow the instrument to receive the sysx before it's got to receive the next piece of sysx. Delay sysx, this actually inserts a delay within a complete sysx transmission. Sometimes a MIDI interface will actually send data to an instrument faster than it can receive it. This is usually just happens with large dumps, maybe a 40,000 sysx byte dump. This allows you to slow down the entire sysx transmission to give the instrument a chance to receive it. And this third parameter works in conjunction with the second parameter, and it can actually increase the time. By default here, what you're doing is adding a delay in every X number of bytes. So if you set this to 100, Midi Quest will start transmitting sysx. It'll transmit 100 bytes, add a 1 millisecond delay. Send another 100 bytes, add a 1 millisecond delay, send another 100 bytes until the entire sysx message is sent. So you might easily have be entering 1,000 here and downloading 1,000 at a time. What this option does is if that delay of 1 millisecond isn't sufficient, you can add additional milliseconds. So adding 1 would make 2 milliseconds or 3 millisecond delay each time a delay is required. Hopefully, and odds are very good, you'll never have to play with these, but if you're dealing with SoundQuest tech support and we see a problem, we may have you change these parameters in an attempt to optimize sysx communication. Tones has already been discussed a little bit with regards to both the patch editor and bank editor auditioning. Tones is just an area you can set up to 16 tones and define how many of those go into creating the sequence or chord that is played when you do an audition. So here you can choose up to 16 notes. Here you can set a playback speed where 1 is the fastest and 16 is the slowest, and that controls how quickly both how long the chord audition lasts and how quickly the sequence plays. And then here is you can select any one of your 16 notes and set the pitch and the note velocity for each of those. The following 4 segments up along here only apply to Midi Quest XL. So if you have a standard version of Midi Quest, just skip forward to where we discuss the paths. name servers. And there are actually 3 of them, 2 of them on this page and 1 here. And what name servers do is they allow Midi Quest to automatically update patch name information for your sequencer, be it Cakewalk through their patch names, or Cubase through the patch scripts, or for, on just the Mac at this point, the midname XML files that many sequencers use to display patch selects by name in the sequencer. So what happens here is, if you want to, these simply correspond to the manual equivalents that you have within Midi Quest itself. So here you have the option to export bank names, and you can export them, say, as a Cubase script or as a Sonar Cakewalk INS file. And these are manual. You can do them whenever you want, and the file gets saved, and off you go. The advantage to using the name servers is that the process is automatic. Every time, if you enable an option, every time you send a bank or a set down to the instrument, Midi Quest looks at the data that's being sent and automatically updates the appropriate files so that your sequencer can then display correctly what is in the instrument. So to enable it, you just check the option, and then for Sonar, you click the Add button, and what you need to do is find the master INS file for your version of Sonar so that Midi Quest can update it. Now, I believe no, I've got the wrong hard drive. How's Cakewalk Sonar? So there's my master INS file. I select this, hit the open button, and there it is. So if I now send a set or a bank, Midi Quest will automatically create or update the bank name entries in the master INS file so that this is correctly set up. Now you'll notice there's a whole list here, so you can continue to support multiple versions of Sonar or older versions of the Cakewalk sequencers just by referencing each of their master INS files. The same applies here with Enable Cubase Name Server. Here, instead of actually going with a file, you need to select the location where your patch name scripts for Sonar are stored. Select that folder, and it will get entered here. And from that point on, as you send out banks, the names will automatically, the equivalent patch script names will automatically be updated. The XML name server operates the exact same way. You enable it. If you're running on Windows, then you probably won't use this option unless you also have a Mac that's connected to a network and you're using, say, a Mac sequencer that's using midname files to assign patch names. You can then again select the directory where those midname files are stored, and Midi Quest will generate midname files for each of the instruments, and you can have your instrument names automatically updated. VST paths. Here, what you want to do is tell Midi Quest where the VST path is for each of the sequencers. Oops, so it's not going to be there. Maybe it's on the G drive. There's Steinberg, QSSX3. So there's your VST plugins folder. Again, this is a list. You can support as many VST plugin paths as you want to match up with whatever sequencers and other audio processing packages you have. When you add entries here, you have the option in the plugins area to automatically define instruments as VST plugins for use with your sequencers. So this just tells Midi Quest where all of your VST paths are for use when creating plugins. On the plugins page, in version 10, Midi Quest now has two types of MFX plugins, two types of VST plugins, and Midi Quest also supports the Studio Connections plugin format that is being supported by Steinberg and hopefully by the time you read this, properly supported by Sonar. And what these options do, there are plugin registration and deregistration options. For each format you check, what happens is Midi Quest will automatically, when you add an instrument to the studio, it will automatically register that instrument as a plugin for the selected plugin formats. And assuming these options are checked, when you remove the instrument from the studio, that instrument will be deregistered from that plugin format. Now there'll be a lot more discussion in other areas about the plugins and how they work. And you can, all of these options can actually be handled manually from the studio window. Here, plugin registration and deregistration. So the preferences is just an automated way of registering your instruments so that you don't have to go through the work of doing it manually each time an instrument is added. Final segment is paths and miscellaneous, and we can look at these options. No file extensions in the registry. Right now, each file extension Midi Quest uses is added to the registry so that the correct little graphics can appear beside your data files when you look at them in Explorer. If you don't want all of this information to be entered in the registry, you can click this and it will lock the addition of this registry information. You can set up a default font for Windows to use in many of the different Midi Quest windows. You can set up a default graphic background if you want. I prefer none. Or you can apply, if you choose disk file, you can actually specify a file name, a path, and a file name, and you can use your own file as a background within Midi Quest. You know, it just looks like one of these. You know, there's the old Midi Quest graphic spread across the background. Oops. Personally, I like mine plain, so I'm going to turn that off. Autosave. Open files every 1 minute. If you check this, you can specify however many minutes With that level of frequency, Midi Quest will, any file that currently has a file name assigned, Midi Quest will automatically go in and save that file so you don't lose any edits if there should be a crash or something should bring your system down. Autosave and reload session. With this checked, when you quit Midi Quest, it will look at all of the windows that are open and their locations, and it will store that information to a file on disk. When you run Midi Quest the next time, it will find each of the files, reopen them, and place them where they were located when you previously quit the application. Now this only works for files that have names assigned. So if you quit Midi Quest and you've got a couple of windows that are just called new, there's been no name or path assigned, that information, you won't get those windows back the next time you run the program. Display application control bar. This is the application control bar up here. You can choose to have it with this option checked, or if you want the space for files and don't really care about the buttons, you can uncheck it. The control bar will stay until the next time you run Midi Quest, at which point you'll have that extra bit of space for editing and window display. The final three options are path setups. Now, unless you know what you're doing, we strongly recommend that you leave these exactly as they are. Program path should always point to the root installed location of where the Midi Quest executable files are located. Instrument path will normally point to the instrument folder, INSTR, below where you have your main application files installed. But as you can see what we have here, we actually keep our instrument files on a different drive from the application files. So you can actually go in and you can set up, you can move your instrument files. Those are the actual definitions, the instrument modules that allow Midi Quest to display and edit each of the instruments. You can put that onto a different drive, put it to a different location, and just make sure the reference here, the path is changed to reference those files, and you can continue on. The same applies to the data path. This is the root of where all of your data files are stored. You can leave it at the default, or if you like to keep your data files on a different hard drive, then you can move all your data files, update this path so that it now references the new location of the MQ data folder, or whatever you call the folder if you rename it, and you are ready to go. These buttons each bring up a folder selector, so you can select the location of, say, the instrument or the data location. These buttons, clicking on them, basically reset these paths to what Midi Quest thinks the default path should be. And we are done with preferences. Now these two dialogues, key setup. We've already discussed keys with relation to the library window. Here you have a list of categories, and each you can have as many categories as you want. Each category has a list of keys, and you can add as many keys as you want to that category. All of this information is stored in a keys.ini file at the root of your application. This allows you to create your own keys so that are applied to banks, to individual patches, to patches in a library that will help you descriptively keep track of what kind of information you have stored. Operation is easy. This is a text entry area if you want to add a new key, a new category. Just type in the new category, hit the add button. If you want to modify an existing one, choose the category, enter the new name, and hit the modify button. Or if you want to remove it altogether, select the one you want to remove and hit the remove button. Category keys, the same concept. If you want to add a new one, just type in the new name or the category name, hit the add button. If you want to modify a name, enter it, hit modify, or if you want to remove one, hit the name, hit the remove. If you have update selected, then what happens here is if you ever remove an entry or modify an entry, then Midi Quest will look at any open library and remap that old key name to the new key name, or if the key name is being deleted, it will take that right out of the library reference. And lastly, we have patch skins. And this looks terribly complicated, and it's not really, but there is quite a bit of data. This area completely defines a skin. Now a skin, let's get an editor back up here so you can see what happens. Whoops, not preferences. A skin is the general style that defines what the editors look like. Each editor will either reference the currently selected default skin, or an editor can have its own skin completely defined within the editor itself, in which case changing this skin will have no effect whatsoever. So a skin, this will display a list of available skins. There's only one here in this case. The skin is what has allowed SoundQuest to continually update the look of its editors without having to start and redo all of the editors from scratch. So we have a number of groups of style information. If you look at most of Midi Quest's controls, you'll find that they have display information selectable of up to 16 different colors. In the early days, all of Midi Quest's backgrounds were just color fills. There was no ability to use bitmaps as background fill. So what we did was take those color references, and they have become bitmap references. So any reference to color 0 by a background drawing area is now replaced by this selected bitmap. Color 1, which is by default referred to as white, gets replaced by this bitmap. And 2, and so everything, all the references from 0 to 15. Now these selections are also controlled by this selector here. So you've got all of these different types. So If you have a filled rectangle that's dominantly horizontal, that rectangle will have some color specifications and they will get filled by these bitmaps. If the filled rectangle is vertical in style, you get this type of fill. If it's a larger than normal rectangle, you take this information. These are standard rectangles and how they're filled. Borders, backgrounds for fills for envelopes, fills for horizontal levels, fills for vertical levels, and graphics for knobs, which previously were all hand entered. So in here, you'll find that many of these have no effect at all, because back then we only used 3 or 4 colors. So these, you can have dramatic changes, usually by changing the first 4 to 5 entries, and the rest will have an effect on only a couple of different editors out of the Midi Quest's huge collection of editors. You can go in, assign your own bitmaps, and you can, after you've made any changes, you can always hit the apply button, and those changes will immediately show up in any editor that's using the standard skin for its display. Tiled. When this option is checked, by default, when the option is unchecked, Midi Quest simply takes the specified bitmap and draws it in once, with the assumption that the bitmap will be at least as large as the area you were trying to fill. Now, if you suspect that this isn't going to be large enough, you can check the tiled option. And what will happen here is that Midi Quest will, into each area, draw this bitmap as many times as is necessary to fill up the area with the specified bitmap. Just a little bit more on these, although this information will all be covered in the online help. Filled rectangles, standard rectangles, borders, these basically all refer to one control type. Let me get into panel. Oh, I can't get into panel edit here. That control type is this background bitmap style that you see here, here, here. These have a number of display options. Whoops. And those display options correspond to the options here. So you can create quite a wide variation in display if you so choose, or you can keep the look very similar as we've done with this one. So again, you've got filled rectangles will be filled with these. Standard rectangles will be filled with these bitmaps. What are defined as borders, we'll use these. Envelope is the graphic that is used to actually display the envelope here in a Midi Quest envelope graphic. Horizontal levels are these controls here, and you see they're all the colors are currently being mapped to use blue. So, but if you wanted, you could actually change this and have only blue refer to blue, and make controls that were previously defined as using red sliders. You could create a red slider and put in red BMP here, if that's what you called your file, and any control that was any slider control that was currently defined to use a red slider for display would start using this red bitmap. Same thing for vertical levels, which there are no vertical levels in this editor. and then knobs, which are these guys here. And right now, they're all using, except for this last one, the same defined knob. Now, knobs are a bit of an anomaly. You should, if you want to start playing with knobs, then you should have a look at the file. In order to make this knob graphic work, what happens is there is a single bitmap file which actually contains a series of pictures going from left to right. Each picture has to be square in proportion. And each square is a different display state for the knob, and what that allows the knob to do is appear to move, because Midi Quest takes just a little piece of the overall graphic and shows it, and as you move, as the values increment, Midi Quest takes a portion of the graphic farther to the right and displays it. If you really wanted to know more about it, find this file on your Midi Quest installation, open it up in any graphic editor, and you'll see exactly how the knobs need to be designed. Envelope. This little area applies to envelope controls, and you can specify that the background of an envelope, that the envelope shape itself is displayed using a bitmap, or you've got an option for original, which will draw in using the specified fill color, and then tiled if you need to, if the area is big enough that you need to place in multiple bitmaps, Midi Quest will do that in order to fill the area. Borders. Borders we've talked about up here. It's the same reference, and again you can have the border use the bitmap that's specified here, or you can have them display as originally designed, which is just a standard frame instead of using a fill. Slider bitmap. Again, these options apply specifically to the graphic slider control, and here you can tell these sliders, that's the vertical slider type, and that's the horizontal slider type. You've got a tiled option, which is exactly the same as discussed up here, and you can there are 3 bitmaps go into creating these graphic sliders. There's the lower bitmap, which is the bitmap that's displayed below the location of the knob graphic, and this is the bitmap that is displayed above the knob graphic, and these 3 areas are just filled in with the appropriate bitmaps, and as you move the slider, the proportions changed, and it looks like you've got a real moving slider. Same rules apply to horizontal. The control background section is by default applies to each of the controls. You can have each control display using one of these. You can have it fill with a bitmap, and you can specify that bitmap. The browse button gives you a file selector to choose the file. You can fill with a color and specify the color. You can fill using the original display style from several years ago, or you can use the background specified information. When you're using a bitmap, you also have, again, a bitmap tiling option in case you need to, in case the supplied bitmap is smaller than the size of the control. For text displayed within controls, you have an option of either specifying a color or specify original display operation. When you specify color, you can press this button, you get a selector, and you can choose the display color for the text when the text is unedited, and the color to use when the text has been edited. So if you notice here, see the standard color is sort of a gray, and here's that same gray for all these controls that have not been edited, and then the edited color matches up with this color, which is the actual parameters that we have edited. Background. You can specify a background bitmap, in which case you enter the path to the bitmap here, or if this isn't checked, then the background of the editor will be displayed with the color you specify here. This area controls font display. You can specify up to 8 different fonts to use in the editors. And here is where you specify each of them. So the first font is, we also call the parameter font. It's used to display all of these controls, and you can click on this. It'll give you a selector. You can choose your font, font style, font size, and so on. Font 1 is the label font. Click on it, assign it, same thing. And so you've got basically 3 standard fonts. The label font you'll see here. This is the label font. This is the parameter font, this one here. And this gives you a number of additional fonts that you can use if you're creating your own editor and you want to get fancy. Color map. Midi Quest has a color map that allows you to assign. Most controls have a color selection assignment section, and this allows you to specify what each of those 16 colors is that you want to use. And finally, you have 2 paths to specify toggle bitmaps for on and off that are the defaults. One additional option, here you have your standard parameter fonts. If you check this option, you can also specify different Mac fonts, which may be more appropriate for display on a Mac equivalent of the editor. Normally, you will only use this if you're working with a custom skin. And that is it. Thank you for viewing the Options Menu tutorial.